Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week we're thinking about the passage in John 14 where Jesus talks about coming with the Father to make a home with the believers, coming with the Father to make a home with the believers. And I have been thinking about this, and for the Rural Challenge I was thinking about what does it mean for us to be welcoming people into our home as a kind of model of that sort of love, and how can we do that? And I think it really depends. I've worked in many different settings and working in places where people do invite people into their homes, and culturally that's a normal thing to do, and places where it's culturally not a normal thing at all to invite people into homes. So how do we make that kind of connection with people, that kind of domestic home connection with people? So if there are people in your community who are very happy to welcome people into their homes, then that can really help build up the church community. But again, we need to be really careful about how we do that. Some places, often not tiny villages, are blessed with village halls, and they can become a very homely place for people to gather, to feel at home, for the church community to be very much at home as well. Or sometimes it's the village pub where the church community can actually gather, have events and be part of a more domestic setting. Or sometimes, and some places have been able to make changes and adjustments to their church buildings where these then can become that real community homely space for their villages. So what is it as a church community? Do we want to reflect how Jesus said that he and the Father were coming into homes? How do we reflect that domestic and homeliness that Jesus was thinking about? How do we reflect that in our church communities? The passage for Thought for the Week this week is John chapter 14 verses 23 to 29, and it's a really interesting passage. I've been thinking a lot this week about what it means when Jesus says this rather odd phrase. He says, "My Father will love them and we will come to them and make our home with them." My Father will love them and we will come and make our home with them. So Jesus is talking about coming and living with us, that he and the Father will come and live with us. And I wonder how much you think about God in a domestic setting and how much you think of God in a kind of aesthetic or non-domestic worship setting. And I've been thinking about this week, and I've been thinking in particular about the whole story about God having a tent with the Israelites. What did it mean that God had his tent with the Israelites in the desert? Now there's all sorts of fantastic instructions about the tent, about the leather, about the stitching, about the number of poles, all those sorts of things. And it can seem quite daunting that why would God need a tent of presence, and why would it need to be so kind of fantastically made in a particular way? But we come from a different point of view. So all around in that area, the other ancient Near Eastern religions had very different views of God. And when we think of Psalm 121, we think of raising our eyes to the hills. That's actually to do with the high place understanding, that the gods were in the high places. So when instead we say, "From whence will my help come?" it's not coming from the high places, it's coming from God. But God has lived domestically with his people. His tent is in the middle of the encampment. God is not in some far off place. He's not in a tree which is in one place. He's not in a rock which is one place. He's not in a mountaintop high place which is one place. God is living with them. That's the understanding of that in the Old Testament. So when Jesus is saying, actually, my Father and I are going to come and live with you. We're going to come and make our home with you. He is echoing this understanding of the tent of the presence from the Old Testament. So he's echoing this domesticity of God as domestic. So I think that's an interesting challenge for us. How do we think about that? When my oldest child was small, they had an imaginary friend, and sometimes their imaginary friends came to tea, and we would set out places for them, and that was fine, and I was very happy with that. That when the request for all of the 10 imaginary friends to have biscuits on each plate, I had to admit I did reply with no, imaginary friends need imaginary biscuits, and that was fine. But actually there are traditions where people would set a place for Jesus at the table. We didn't do that in our household. I think it would have been an interesting thing to do. It's certainly an interesting thing to think about. How do we understand God to be domestically with us? When Jesus says, I'm going to come and be with you, is it helpful for us to set a place for Jesus at the table? What would it help us to think about? How does it tie in with our understanding? Jesus goes on in this passage to talk about the Holy Spirit, and we don't have this reading for any of our Trinity Sunday readings, although I think it's quite an interesting way of thinking about it, that what's happening is that Jesus and the Father are coming to live with us, and the Spirit is helping us to understand how that's going to work, how that is going to be possible. I think it's a really interesting understanding of what Jesus is saying about the Trinity. But most of all, I wanted us to think, what does it mean that God lives with us? That the purpose that Jesus is talking about is that he is domestically with us. Not in some different place, not in a high place, not up a mountaintop, not in a church building, but God is with us. He is coming home to be with us. The Dibley moment of the week this week is about the year where we nearly didn't have a tent for the teas at the village fete because it was so rainy and so windy that all the tents were being blown all over the place whilst they were being erected. In the end, some very clever people managed to I think lash together some of the broken poles, so we were able to provide shelter for people during, honestly, the wettest village fete which I have ever been to. But still we were able to be dry in our tent. Well, that's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week where you will know God's presence with you.